Shabbat Shalom. As we begin the book of Shemot, Sefer Shemot, the book of Exodus in English, I know that we all pray that soon, very quickly, the hostages still languishing in Gaza will find their own exodus and their own liberation and return home to their families. I was thinking a lot about Sefer Shemot, especially the first Parsha, because it's one of my favorites. And I was thinking about it because there's sort of an irony right at the beginning of the Parsha. At the very beginning, we hear, these are the names of the sons of Jacob who went down to Egypt. Now, there were obviously a lot more people, and we read about that just at the end of Genesis, the whole group of people, more than 70 people that went down to Egypt. Obviously, by the time we get to our Parsha this week, there's a lot more because of the years of slavery and time in Egypt. But still, even with that 72, there was something interesting. There was only one woman who was mentioned, Sarah bat Asher. And this week, we read, these are the names, and there isn't a single woman that's mentioned. We just read of the sons of Jacob. We don't even mention Dinah, the daughter, and she sort of disappeared anyway from the story, although the rabbis find her at least a little bit in not this Parsha, but the Parsha dealing with Joseph. And it's ironic because if we read especially this first Parsha from Shemot, we find again and again the remarkable work of women in achieving the exodus from Egypt. So we read, these are the men, but really, these are the women who actually made it happen. So we learn of Miriam and Yocheved, Moshe's mother and mother and daughter. No, I'm really getting confused. Moshe's mother and sister. I knew there was some family relationship. We read of Moshe's mother and sister, and there we read how important they were. Obviously, Moshe's mother gave birth, but not only that, she protected Moshe and ensured that he would be safe, even though Pharaoh had decreed the death to the boys, and places him in the ark. And we know that Miriam watches over and is there when the third woman, Pharaoh's daughter, picks him up from the water and knows exactly who this child is. She knows that this is an Israelite child. She knows that this might be the one, at least according to the Midrash, who was destined to overthrow or at least cause serious problems for her father. And even so, she determines to preserve the baby. And then a little girl comes over and says, I know a wet nurse. We know, or at least it's there, that also here we have, she probably knew exactly who this little girl was, and she probably knew exactly who the wet nurse was, who raised Moshe to know who he was, because it was his own mother. So we have these remarkable women, and Miriam and Yocheved are seen as remarkable in the Midrash. Miriam especially is seen as one who actually saves the Jewish people way before her brother Moshe saves the Jewish people. Because Miriam, according to the Midrash, challenges her father. Pharaoh decrees the death of all boys, and so Amram, Moshe's father, decides the best way to save the boys is not to have any. And how do you ensure you're not going to have any? He has all the men divorce their wives. That's the right answer, right? That's how you save a people, by destroying them. And Miriam, you can imagine this little girl, goes up to her, like the kids who come up for the Torah, Miriam goes to her father and says, Dad, you're worse than Pharaoh. And I guess Amram probably looked a bit confused. And she says, you're worse than Pharaoh because Pharaoh only decreed the death of the boys, but you've decreed the death of all the future girls as well. And so, according to the Midrash, Amram remarries Yocheved, and they have Moshe, and the rest is history. But maybe it should be herstory instead of history. Now, in thinking about the Parsha, And I focused, actually, if anybody was here last year, I think a week or two later, when I spoke on Saturday morning, I talked about the women who were pivotal in leading us from slavery to freedom, the women of this Parsha. And they were Miriam Yocheved and Batya, Pharaoh's daughter, Zipporah, Moses' wife, who in a very strange way and helps and preserves Moshe at the end of the Parsha. But I also mentioned Shifra and Puah, and I want to think about them a little bit in a very different way than I did last year, not only because of their role as women who helped save us, really marking the fact that women are so important in this Parsha, but also thinking about who exactly Shifra and Puah were. What was their identity? Now, we don't know much. All we know of Shifra and Puah is found in 3 verses from the Torah. And this is Exodus 15 through 17. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shifra, and the other Puah, saying, when you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it's a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, let her live. And the midwives, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them, but they let the boys live. And then the Torah also mentions that they say the Hebrew women are so quick that we don't have a chance to even deliver the babies. And so, and because they feared God, God made them the parents God preserved their families. So we have here this very strange story, and who exactly these women are isn't clear. Now it says here in our translation, the Hebrew midwives, and that reflects one of the traditions about Shifra and Puah. It reflects the idea that they were Israelites. They were Hebrew midwives. Now, this is advanced and supported by Rashi, and it's also supported by the Talmud itself. And in fact, not only are Shifra and Puah Hebrew midwives, but they're even more special because you know who they are? Anybody know? They're none other than Yocheved, mother, and little girl Miriam, daughter. And the rabbi, Hillary's thinking that sounds very strange, but it's not the only time when people have numerous names in the Bible. So think, for example, Jacob, Israel, at least 2 names there. So people have different names. We have Sinai, we have Horeb. What's the name of the mountain? Who knows? But so names are that's not such a leap, and it reflects an understanding of the Hebrew. But there also is another tradition, and this tradition is exemplified by Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, also by Rabbi Samuel Lazzuto, and also by others. And they suggest that these women were not Israelites. They suggest that these women were righteous Gentiles who feared God, who were in awe of God, and knew what was right. And they have very good logic to think about this. After all, how would you react if you were Miriam and Yocheved and you were given this order? Maybe you'd be afraid of Pharaoh, but you certainly wouldn't do it. And Pharaoh probably would know that his midwives, who were Israelites, certainly wouldn't be the best ones to give the orders to murder the male babies. So Rabbi Yehuda Chassid says this can't be true because Pharaoh wouldn't have commanded Miriam and Yocheved to kill Jews. But instead he says they were Egyptians who later converted to Judaism because of their awe and fear of God and their knowledge of what was right. Now, that sounds very sensible, and it's picked up by Lazzuto, as I said as well, later on towards the end of the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. So we have a number of rabbis who certainly support the idea that they're Israelites, and we have other rabbis that support the fact that they were not. And of course, the ramifications are very different. There is a trend in the Hebrew Bible, not in the Hebrew Bible, but in our rabbinic tradition to try to look at everything from a very Jewish lens and to make most of the heroes of our Bible into Jews. They don't succeed with Rahab and Ruth, at least initially, though they do say that they converted. And Batya goes off from Egypt into freedom and becomes Jewish, but she at least starts Egyptian. But there is this trend with people like Shifra and Puah to make sure they're Jewish. Even Joseph's wife, the daughter of Potiphar, becomes for some rabbis Jewish, and none other than the daughter of Dinah, who was inconveniently Joseph's half-sister, so he's marrying his niece. But for those rabbis, it's better that Joseph marry his half-sister's daughter than marry an Egyptian. They were thinking about the ideas of intermarriage. And we do find in the 19th century and early 20th century a trend among many Orthodox commentators on this parsha to embrace this idea that Shifra and Puah must have been Israelites and not Egyptian. And they say, they look at Lizudo, they look at Rabbi Hasid, and they say these guys don't know what they're talking about. In fact, they are almost blasphemous because it says in our sacred Talmud that the women were Jewish, therefore they must have been Jewish. There was some real push to not see them as Gentiles, but to look as Gentiles as evil, to look as Gentiles who are our enemies, rather than people who can be our supporters, rather than people who can help us. So that is certainly a rather troubling idea for those rabbis, but it's something that is of long standing within the Jewish tradition. And in fact, there's an article that I read on this parsha, and there the authors claim that these modern rabbis were suppressing this alternative tradition of Shifra and Puah being Egyptian. They were suppressing it because they didn't want to see the positive in the non-Jewish world. But what's interesting is none other than Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, former chief rabbi of England, of the Great Britain, of blessed memory. Rabbi Sacks definitely identifies Shifra and Puah as Egyptian, but not only as Egyptian, as the absolute model of righteous Gentiles, as the absolute model of acting for justice in the world. And he says the following: we don't know to which people they belonged because their particular form of moral courage transcends nationality and race. In essence, they were being asked to commit a crime against humanity, and they refused. All we know about them is they feared God and did not do what the Egyptian king had commanded. So Rabbi Sacks, he sort of adopts both approaches, but he certainly sees the idea that they can be righteous Gentiles. And in fact, he says that they exemplify the righteous Gentile by refusing to obey an immoral order, and they redefine the moral imagination of the world. And he says they teach us the following lesson. They ask us, who are the people who they ask, and he says, the United States Declaration of Human Rights is built on this idea with the recognition of the inherent dignity of the equal, the inalienable rights of all members of the human family, and that Shifra and Puah, as righteous Gentiles, teach us this important message. So for Rabbi Sacks, the identity isn't important, though he aims and leans, I think, towards there being Gentiles, but he really pushes us to see that they are the models of how we need to act in the world. We need to look and see where injustice is being done and stand up for that which is right. We need not to fear speaking out. Instead, it's our obligation to speak out. I once came upon what really is a bit of a midrash dealing with this story during the Holocaust. And I don't know exactly where this came from, because I found it in a book of sources, but it went as follows, that there was a church in Holland during World War II. The people were at church, they were praying and doing whatever they do, and worshiping, and a stranger comes in to the church. I like to think he's Elijah the prophet, but it doesn't say so. And he asked the people, and they were reading from this story of Shifra and Puah, and he asked the people, who is the evil king of our time? And then he says, even more importantly, who are the midwives? So he was asking them, who are the ones who will stand up against the injustice of Hitler? And he's asking us, who are we are we the ones who will stand up in the injustices of our time as well? So Shifra and Puah for me really should have street signs outside, along with Rollenberg, Mendez, and also Sugihara, because they were the first, they were the model of people who saw the injustice that was happening. They were the model and stood up as righteous Gentiles. Now, this is not particularly revolutionary to think about righteous Gentiles and to see non-Jews as important as Jews in upholding the world. In Judaism, we have a concept of 36 righteous people, Lamed Vavniks. If anybody read Last of the Just, you'll remember the story. But these are simple people who, by simple actions, are the ones that ensure that the world will remain, that the world can move towards redemption. And they can be very simple people doing very simple actions. I like to think of them as the Lone Rangers of Jewish history, because they're the ones who act behind the scenes, and then it's only when they're gone that someone asks, who were those masked people? And the answer is, they were the Lamed Vavniks. They were the Lone Ranger. But what's interesting, there are many Hasidic stories about the Lamed Vavniks, and many times they may be Jewish, but other times they're not Jewish. They might be a simple wood chopper who makes sure that an old person by the edge of the town always had wood, or doing simple actions like ensuring that people have company, or people have food, or people have what they need in very, very simple ways. But they always do it not because they necessarily are commanded, but instead because they know it's right. They know that these people need help, and they want to ensure that they're there for these people. And then, of course, at the end of the story, as the Rebbe is telling it, all his students say, who was this person that did this? And the Rebbe answers, they were the Lamed Vavniks. So Shifra and Puah, they're the first, but they're in a long line of people, Jewish and non-Jewish, who stood up to make the world a better place. They're the first who are the names that are forgotten, the names that aren't included in the beginning list, but are the names that really stand out. So in our Parsha this week, when we begin with the words, these are the names, yes, we should remember our ancestors, all of the sons of Jacob. But in addition to the names of the sons of Jacob who begin our book of Exodus, we should remember Miriam, Yocheved, Shifra, Puah, Batya, Tzipporah, and many, many more. The simple people who helped and ensured that we were ready to move from slavery to freedom. The simple people who ensured that the world is a better place because they were there. Shabbat Shalom. So pardon me, we're going to continue now with